You are looking at a face that 500,000 people travel to Berlin to see every single year. And almost none of them know that the face they are looking at might not be the real one. Beneath a few millimeters of paint and plaster, sealed away for over 3,000 years, sits a second face. Older, rougher, human. And the moment scientists finally saw it clearly, it raised a question that historians still haven't agreed on an answer to. Was this an artist's revision, or was it something closer to a disguise? Let's start with what you actually know about her, because it's probably less than you think. The bust belongs to Nefertiti, the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, and it's one of the most reproduced images from the ancient world. It sits behind protective glass in Berlin's News Museum, lit to keep its pigments glowing after more than 3 millennia. People call her the most beautiful woman in history. Magazine covers use her face as shorthand for ancient elegance. And yet the object itself was pulled out of the sand without a single label attached to it. No name carved anywhere on the piece. The identification as Nefertiti came later, built by scholars comparing her crown, her proportions, and her context to carvings of the queen found elsewhere at the same site. It's a strong identification, one that's held up for over a century. But it's worth remembering that this famous face started its modern life as an anonymous one. The bust was found in the winter of 1912, during a German excavation at Tel El Amarna, the short-lived desert capital built by Akhenaten in the middle of Egypt. The dig team was working through the collapsed remains of a sculptor's workshop when they uncovered her, lying on her side, still coated in millennia of dust. The site belonged to a sculptor named Thutmose, identified from an ivory horse blinker found nearby inscribed with his title, the king's favorite and master of works. This wasn't some junior craftsman practicing technique. Thutmose was the top sculptor of his era, trusted with producing the official image of the royal family. Whatever ended up in his workshop was not an accident. It was a working reference piece, sitting among unfinished busts, plaster casts, and tools, in the kind of studio where a master model gets copied again and again by other artists across the kingdom. That workshop held more than just the one bust. Excavators also found an unfinished head of one of Nefertiti's daughters, a scattering of plaster casts, and other partially completed pieces that give researchers a rare window into how royal portraiture was actually produced at Amarna. Taken together, the site looks less like a private artist's studio and more like a production facility for the Reignited public image, a place where an approved likeness could be checked, refined, and copied out to other workshops so that the queen's face looked consistent no matter where in the kingdom people encountered it. That context matters, because it's part of why some researchers treat the bust as more than a beautiful object on its own. It may well have functioned as a kind of master template, the version every other sculptor across the kingdom was expected to match. The bust also has a complicated modern history that's separate from anything the scan revealed, but worth knowing. It left Egypt as part of the division of archaeological finds that was common practice in that era, an arrangement that has since become genuinely controversial, with Egyptian authorities periodically renewing calls for its return to Cairo. It survived the bombing of Berlin during the Second World War, hidden for a time along with other treasures before eventually settling into the News Museum, where it now draws roughly 500,000 visitors a year. None of that has anything to do with what's carved beneath the plaster, but it's a reminder that this object's fame comes tangled up with questions of ownership and colonial-era archaeology that are still being argued about today, separately from anything the CT scanner found. For most of the last century, the working theory about how the bust was made was simple and reasonable. Sculptors of the period often built up a statue in stages, rough out the general shape in stone, then apply a layer of gypsum plaster, called stucco, to add the fine surface detail, and finally paint the whole thing. Under that theory, the limestone core beneath Nefertiti's painted stucco surface would just be a rough, unfinished support, a blank shape waiting to be dressed up. Nobody could confirm that assumption for decades, because you don't chip into one of the most famous surviving artifacts on Earth just to check. The bust is fragile, irreplaceable, and any invasive test risked damaging something no one could ever rebuild. The turning point came with medical imaging. In 2006, a team led by Dr. Alexander Huppitz, director of the Imaging Science Institute at Berlin's Charité Hospital, brought the bust in for a CT scan using a 64-slice scanner capable of resolving detail down to a fraction of a millimeter. This is the same basic technology hospitals used to look for tumors or fractures, just aimed at a limestone queen instead of a patient. The scanner fires X-rays through the object from hundreds of angles, and a computer reconstructs a three-dimensional map of everything inside. The dense limestone, the softer plaster, the thickness of every layer, right down to hairline cracks invisible from the outside. What the scan revealed surprised even the researchers who ran it. The stucco layer over most of the bust, the ears, the crown, the back of the head, was thin and even, exactly what you'd expect from a finishing coat. But over the face, the plaster thickened noticeably, and beneath that thicker layer, the limestone wasn't a rough blank at all. It was a fully realized, carefully carved face in its own right, complete with its own expression and its own details. Huppert's put it plainly in his published findings. Until that scan, nobody knew whether a second face existed underneath, or whether the stone was simply a support structure. It turned out to be a finished piece of art in itself. It's worth pausing on just how much of a technical leap this actually was, because the bust had been scanned once before, back in 1992, and that earlier attempt hadn't caught any of this. The scanner used in the early 90s could only generate cross-sections roughly every 5 millimeters, which sounds precise until you realize the detail hiding under the stucco sat just 1 to 2 millimeters beneath the surface. It was simply too fine a structure for the older equipment to resolve. The 2006 scan used a 64-slice spiral CT machine with sub-millimeter resolution, essentially letting researchers slice the bust into a stack of digital cross-sections thin enough to catch a boundary that had gone completely unnoticed for 80 years. Beyond the face, the same scan also mapped fissures in the shoulders, the underside of the bust, and the back of the crown, information the museum has since used to figure out exactly how carefully the object needs to be handled and displayed to keep it from being damaged. In other words, the scan wasn't performed to manufacture a controversy. It was primarily a conservation study, and the second face was a byproduct nobody had specifically gone looking for. And that inner face isn't identical to the one the world knows. According to the CT data published in the journal Radiology, the limestone face beneath the stucco has creases at the corners of the mouth, a bit less depth around the eyelids, less pronounced cheekbones, and a small bump along the bridge of the nose. Every one of those features is smoothed away in the outer, painted version. The stucco face is more symmetrical, more youthful, more idealized. The stone face underneath reads as older, more lived in, and more specific, closer. In other words, to what an actual person's face looks like after years of expression settling into it. Here's where it's important to be careful, because this is the part of the story that tends to get exaggerated online. The differences between the two faces are real, and they are documented in a peer-reviewed radiology journal, not a rumor. But they are subtle. We're talking about creases at the mouth, a slight bump on the nose, cheekbones that sit a few millimeters differently, not two dramatically different women, and not some hidden monster face lurking under a mask. Huppert's himself offered a fairly grounded explanation. The retouching visible in the stucco may simply reflect the aesthetic ideals of the period, the same instinct that makes any portrait artist soften a wrinkle or idealize a feature to match the standards of beauty their culture expected from royal imagery. In plainer terms, ancient Egyptian royal sculpture, like a lot of royal art across history, wasn't necessarily aiming for a snapshot. It was aiming for an idealized image of power and divinity, built on top of a genuine likeness. But that isn't the end of the story, because reasonable idealization is one explanation, and it's not the only one scholars have put on the table. Some Egyptologists point out that this kind of two-stage construction, a faithful undercarving covered by an idealized outer layer, matches something bigger going on in Akhenaten's reign. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand just how strange this particular moment in Egyptian history really was. Akhenaten inherited one of the wealthiest and most stable empires in the ancient world, and then he did something no pharaoh before him had attempted. He turned Egypt's religious structure inside out. For thousands of years, Egyptian worship centered on a wide pantheon of gods, each with temples, priesthoods, festivals, and enormous economic power. Akhenaten elevated a single deity above all the others, the Aten, represented not as a human or animal figure but as the visible disk of the sun itself, its rays ending in small hands reaching down toward the royal family. He didn't just add a new god to the mix. He moved against the old ones, closing temples, redirecting their wealth, and ordering the names of the old chief god chiseled out of monuments across the country, some of which had stood for centuries. He then abandoned the traditional capital altogether and built an entirely new city in the desert, at a site now known as Amarna, dedicated to his new religious vision. Consider what a shift like that meant on the ground, not just in theory. The old priesthood of the chief god had, over centuries, accumulated enormous landholdings, grain stores, and gold, effectively operating as a second center of power alongside the throne. When Akhenaten redirected that wealth and shut down the old temple system, he wasn't just making a theological statement. He was dismantling the economic base of Egypt's most established institution virtually overnight, and doing it in a country that had never seen anything like it before. That's the kind of move that creates enemies, and it's part of why historians view the backlash that followed his death as being about more than religion. It was also a very practical restoration of power to people who had lost it. A change of that scale doesn't run on decree alone. It runs on imagery, repeated constantly until it becomes the accepted picture of reality. And the imagery Akhenaten's reign produced put Nefertiti at the very center of it. On the walls and reliefs of Amarna, she doesn't appear in the traditional supporting pose reserved for Egyptian queens. She's shown making offerings directly to the Aten, a role usually associated with the king or the priesthood. One surviving fragment shows her in the traditional smiting pose, gripping an enemy and preparing to strike him down, an image that, for millennia, had been reserved almost exclusively for the pharaoh. Scholars differ on exactly how much formal power that reflects, but there's broad agreement that Nefertiti functioned as something well beyond a decorative consort. She was presented as a central figure of the new religious order, arguably a co-ruler in practice if not always in title. Nefertiti and Akhenaten also had 6 known daughters together, several of whom appear repeatedly in the Amarna art, shown as small, individually named children accompanying their parents at religious ceremonies. Their prominence in the official record is itself unusual for the period, and it reinforces the sense that this was a family whose every public appearance was being used to sell the new religious order to the wider population. It also means that when the succession crisis hit after Akhenaten's death, it hit a family that had very few adult male heirs, which is part of why the eventual rise of the young Tutankhamun, a boy not yet 10 years old when he took the throne, needed so much stage managing from the adults around him. If that's the role she occupied, then a sculpture of her face was never just a private keepsake. It was propaganda in the most literal, functional sense, an official image meant to be copied and distributed so that every representation of the queen across the kingdom matched a single, sanctioned model. Seen that way, the choice to soften a real woman's features into something more symmetrical and ageless makes a certain kind of political sense. It's not necessarily proof of a cover-up. It might simply be branding, the ancient equivalent of an official portrait retouched to project stability and divine favor rather than the wear of a real human life. That's a real, respected interpretation among some historians. It is still an interpretation, not a settled fact, and it's worth holding it that way. What happened to Nefertiti afterward is where the historical record gets genuinely murky, and where you have to be extra careful separating solid evidence from speculation, because this is the part of her story that gets exaggerated the most in viral content. Sometime around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti stops appearing in the official record under her name. There's no clear depiction of her death, no obviously prepared tomb, at least none that has been definitively identified. Her name is also chiseled out of a number of inscriptions, which on its own is a striking detail, because erasing a name from stone was a deliberate act, not something that happens by accident or neglect. At roughly the same time, a new royal name appears in the record, Nefertiti, a name carrying titles with feminine grammatical markers, suggesting the person holding this kingly title was a woman. A number of respected Egyptologists, most notably Nicholas Reeves, have argued that Nefertiti and Nefertiti were the same person, that after Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti didn't disappear at all, but instead took the throne herself, ruling briefly as a female pharaoh before the boy king known to history as Tutankhamun took power. It's a compelling argument built from genuine textual and archaeological evidence, and it has real support in the field. It is also actively debated. Other scholars propose that Nefertiti was actually one of Akhenaten's daughters, or possibly a lesser-known secondary wife, ruling briefly during the chaos of the transition. Without a securely inscribed tomb or name written next to a clearly identified mummy, Egyptologists are left arguing from indirect evidence, grammar in surviving titles, the order in which certain names appear on king lists compiled generations later, and the physical placement of specific objects in the archaeological record. It's genuinely one of the more unresolved puzzles in the period, and any documentary that tells you with total confidence exactly who Nefertiti was is skipping past a real, ongoing academic argument. This is also where a female pharaoh in Egyptian history isn't without precedent, which is part of what makes the theory plausible rather than far-fetched. Roughly a century before Nefertiti's era, Hatshepsut had already ruled Egypt as a fully recognized king, adopting the traditional royal regalia, including the ceremonial false beard associated with pharaonic authority, and presiding over one of the more stable and prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Her example shows that the machinery of Egyptian kingship could, under the right circumstances, accommodate a woman holding the throne outright rather than functioning only as a consort. That precedent is one of the pieces of context scholars point to when arguing that Nefertiti stepping into a kingly role after her husband's death wouldn't have been without any parallel at all. The uncertainty deepens from there. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered famously intact in 1922, contains a number of objects that show evidence of reworking. Inscriptions recarved, titles altered, some pronouns changed from feminine to masculine forms. This has led some researchers to argue that several of the treasures buried with the boy king were originally made for an adult, and quite possibly for a woman who reigned before him, then reassigned and modified after her fall from power or death. Separately, a badly damaged mummy found in a side chamber of the Valley of the Kings, catalogued as KV21b, has drawn attention because of genetic testing suggesting a close family relationship to Tutankhamun, potentially even a maternal one. Some researchers have proposed she could be Nefertiti. This identification is far from settled. The genetic sampling from Egyptian royal mummies of this period is notoriously difficult to work with given degradation over 3,000 years, and multiple competing theories about the identities of these mummies exist in the literature. Presenting KV21b as confirmed to be Nefertiti, or her injuries as confirmed evidence of a violent death, would be going well past what the current evidence actually supports. What we can say honestly is that it's one hypothesis among several, argued by some specialists and contested by others. There's also a more sensational thread that circulates online involving a supposed hidden chamber behind a wall in Tutankhamun's tomb. Their Eyes by Nicholas Reeves based on radar scans that seem to show faint straight lines suggestive of a sealed doorway. Follow-up scans by different teams produce conflicting results, with some suggesting the anomalies were just natural variations in the rock rather than a hidden passage. As of the most recent published surveys, the question has not been resolved in favor of a hidden chamber, and the Egyptian Antiquities authorities have not confirmed the existence of any sealed room behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber. It's a real, ongoing scientific disagreement, not a confirmed discovery, and it deserves to be treated that way rather than presented as an established fact. So where does that leave us with the actual bust, the object the scan was performed on? What solid, peer-reviewed, and well-documented is this? Thutmose carved a genuinely detailed, individualized face into the limestone core, and then a craftsman applied a stucco layer that softened several of that face's features into something more idealized. That's real. It's published. It's been replicated in the imaging data. Everything past that point, whether the retouching reflects simple aesthetic convention or something closer to deliberate political image control, whether Nefertiti ruled afterward as pharaoh, whether a particular mummy belongs to her, whether a hidden chamber exists somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, sits somewhere between credible scholarly hypothesis and open, unresolved debate. Egyptology, more than most fields, has to work with fragments, a broken inscription here, a partial genetic sample there, a name gouged out of stone for reasons nobody wrote down. That's part of what makes the field endlessly interesting, and it's also exactly why it's worth being honest about which parts of the Nefertiti story are established fact, and which parts are still argued over in academic journals. What nobody disputes is the strange fate of the bust itself. It survived largely because it left the ground without a name attached to it. Every monument that named Nefertiti explicitly became a target during the political reversals that followed the Amarna period, when later rulers moved to erase the memory of Akhenaten's religious revolution almost entirely. An anonymous studio model, sitting among tools and unfinished plaster casts in a collapsed workshop, simply wasn't on anyone's list of things to destroy. The very thing that makes her identity uncertain today, the missing inscription, may be the reason she survived at all. It also says something about how we build our images of the past more generally. Almost every civilization that has produced official royal portraiture has faced some version of the same choice Thutmose faced. How much of the real person to show, and how much of the ideal the culture demands. Ancient Roman emperors were sometimes depicted with the youthful, idealized features of gods well into their old age. Renaissance monarchs commissioned court painters who were expected, quietly, to trim a decade or two off the sitter's apparent age. What makes the Nefertiti bust remarkable isn't that this kind of retouching happened. It's that, for the first time, we can actually see both versions at once, stacked one on top of the other, thanks to a piece of medical equipment designed for an entirely different purpose finding its way into an art conservation lab 3,000 years later. There's something worth sitting with in that. The face the world fell in love with was never fully hazed to begin with. It passed through the hands of an artist working within the visual rules of his era, softened in exactly the way official portraits of powerful rulers so often are, in almost every culture, in almost every century. And underneath that idealized surface is a face that looks, by every account from the people who've actually studied the scan data, more like an actual woman who lived and aged over 3,000 years ago. Modern CT technology didn't uncover a scandal. It uncovered craftsmanship, and a small, human detail buried under a few millimeters of plaster. Creases at the mouth, a bump on the nose, the kind of thing every real face collects over time, deliberately smoothed away by someone who understood exactly what kind of image a young, radical, and deeply contested royal court needed the world to see. So here's the question worth leaving you with. If the more human, more weathered face is the real one, and the polished version the world reveres is a kind of retouched official portrait, does that change how you see her? Would you want museums to reconstruct and display the face underneath, lines and all? Or is there something honest about letting the version the world already knows stand exactly as it is? Let me know what you think in the comments.